My next guest is a social scientist who has been studying the impact of technology and particularly that of social networking. And he's arrived at some very different conclusions. Pleased to be joined in the hood right here by Professor of Communications, Keith Hampton of Rutgers University. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate this. This will be fun. All right. So you're going to be giving a keynote address tomorrow, but we're delighted to get a chance to talk with you right now, help put research in focus. Don't forget, by the way, to our online audience, you can join this conversation if you're inspired, something you've been wondering about in this realm. You can send your questions in to me, to Keith. I'll relay them here. Just use that tool right there in the viewer there. Okay, so Keith, unlike most speakers and attendees here at the Microsoft Faculty Summit, you're a sociologist, not a computer scientist. But that's not as anomalous as it might first seem, since first, everyone on Facebook knows computer technologies an enormous impact on our social behaviors. Everywhere we look around, somebody's on their phone, they're doing it right. So you're looking into just how social media affects us both as individuals, as a society. And before we even get into your current research about that, I think our viewers would probably like to know a bit more about your background, exactly how you got interested in this line of research.
Sure. I mean, I got into this in the late 1990s with a study of a wired suburb that was actually built north of Toronto. And it was a similar kind of moral panic of the day about how broadband technology would affect relationships.
Right.
There was a lot of concern that if you provided people with a computer in their house and everybody had one, and then you gave them always-on internet access, that they would choose to abandon their neighbors and other close relationships. So I spent 2 years moving into one such community, living in the neighborhood, and studying how those technologies were affecting local relationships in those settings.
Wow. Okay. So it perhaps is just viewing the past through rose-colored glasses, but I think most people believe that social media has sort of been detrimental since it replaced, what a lot of people think is, nobody talks anymore. Nobody does face-to-face, person-to-person interactions. It's all kind of self-absorbed in tweets. Look what I'm eating. Look what I'm doing. Look where I'm vacationing. But that's, of course, just opinion. How do you actually study how technology, in particular social media, has impacted our social behaviors?
Right. So, I mean, I think rose-colored glasses is exactly the way to frame it. My talk tomorrow is about whether the grass is, in fact, any greener than it was in the past. And I think that every technological change is accompanied by a concern about whether those technologies are going to destroy society, destroy relationships, make us more alienated. And this is really just the latest one. The ideal way to study these is to be able to study them over time in terms of some sort of historical comparative way of measuring change. And lately we had one opportunity to do that in studying how new mobile phones technologies might be affecting people in public spaces, for example. So we got our hands on a series of Super 8 films, a really big archive of people just walking around in public spaces that was taken about 30 years ago. And those were films that were taken in New York City, in Philadelphia, and in Boston. And we were able to go back to the exact same settings that those films were taken 30 years ago and take pictures today, video.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then we were able to compare the content of the film 30 years ago to the content of the film today to see if people were more likely to be walking alone, to see if there was a role for mobile phones in these spaces, to see if there was any kind of change in the composition of people's interactions in those spaces. And we observed about 150,000 people in our coding. We did by hand. I'm not a computer scientist. And what we found was that over 30 years, people are in fact less likely to be walking alone in public spaces. We found people more likely to spend time in groups. Those groups tended to be more diverse. People, for the most part, weren't using their mobile phones in public spaces, maybe 2 to 10% in our most extreme cases. And in places where there were more groups, that's where people were less likely to be using their mobile phones. It was really an activity that people were doing when they would otherwise be isolated in a public space.
Okay, so let's talk about what about private as opposed to the public spaces. Has social media usage had a negative impact on our closest relationships with friends, family, at home?
Right. Well, again, we had an opportunity to do a bit of a historical comparative study in this sense. In the 1980s and again in 2004, the United States General Social Survey did a series of questions that focused on people's closest relationships. And they were able to model whether or not people had fewer close ties today than they did, say, 20 years ago. The big and kind of surprising finding of that was that they found that the number of close ties that people had declined over time. And the diversity of those relationships had declined as well. The time period, again, kind of matched to the rise of the internet, the rise of home computing, but they didn't really have very good data on whether or not individual uses of those technology and how people were using the technology were responsible for any of that increase in, decrease in the size of people's close ties. So I partnered with the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life project in 2009 and 2011. We did two really big, large national random surveys of Americans,
Right.
where we asked them that same question that they asked in the general social survey. And what we found was that, in fact, the number of close ties people have doesn't seem to be negatively affected by their use of technologies. In fact, we found no negative relationships between people's use of mobile phones, social networking sites, internet use at all, and having a smaller core network on average.
Wow.
What we did find is that people who use social media in particular, but also just the internet overall, tend to have more close relationships, and those relationships tend to be more diverse. They have more friends that aren't just family.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these networks we've all created, yeah, some people see it as an obligation. Some people, as you say, kind of create these networks of people that they maybe don't see face to face, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Well, that's true. Although we do find amongst our closest ties that new technologies such as Facebook and other kind of social networking technologies aren't really substituting for face-to-face interaction. If anything, they're adding on to it. And we're finding that the more people interact with different types of digital technologies, the more they tend to see each other in person as well. And that's especially true of our closest relationships.
Okay, so what if we turn our attention away from just individuals and now talk about society more broadly? Let's talk about the impact of social media on us as citizens, voters. For instance, how does social media affect our awareness of different points of views? Obviously, anyone who uses Twitter knows that it's kind of become an information and a news source in addition to just a way to have some fun and share fun stuff.
Yeah, well, again, through studies with Pew Internet and Everyday Life, we were able to find that the average person who uses these new technologies, just internet use in general, and then the more they use social media, the more diverse their networks tend to be. So they do tend to know people of a greater number of different perspectives, the people of different social classes, and kind of span the whole social hierarchy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what at least I would assume that a lot of folks are going to go kind of hide in their pockets of social media and the internet that they feel comfortable in. Does this make us more aware of outside perspectives? Does it silo us in those little chat rooms where we converse with only the people that are like-minded?
Well, that's a more complicated picture.
Yeah.
So we know from other studies before the internet came along that there's something called the spiral of silence, and that the more aware you are of the different points of view, it actually tends to reduce your ability to have democratic deliberation to some sense. So if you're aware that there's a lot of disagreement in a social setting that you're in, just because of that heightened awareness, you may actually feel less willing to speak out about something.
Probably, yeah, less likely to voice opinions on political issues, for example.
Right. So, I mean, it's actually an odd little bit of a paradox. We are much more aware of that diversity around us, but that awareness of diversity may also have this kind of negative effect on us, and that it makes us slightly less willing to speak out when there's that kind of uncertainty.
Wow. Okay, well, then let's talk about the trickle down there. The effect of social media on our democracy is affecting things like voter participation, involvement in campaigning, and so on. I mean, does it get that far?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of difference between, democratic deliberation, which is what we're talking about in terms of people's willingness to speak out, and democratic participation. And in fact, they may be very different things. And there's some evidence to suggest that you can't necessarily have a lot of both, that places where there's a lot of deliberation, you start to appreciate the other side more, it actually may reduce participation to some level. But what we're finding is, again, internet users in general, and particularly users of social media, from another study we did with the Pew Research Center, we found that they are, in fact, more likely to attend political meetings. They're more likely to try and persuade other people to vote, and they're more likely to say that they're going to vote themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so let's take it down now to the local level. I understand you've also investigated the impact of social networks on neighborhoods. What have you learned about its effect on community involvement in the neighborhoods in specific?
Right. So after the Netville study, which was this project where I spent 2 years doing this ethnography, I've done a series of other studies where we observed how neighborhoods change over time as a result of digital technologies. And one of the things we found is that, the simple introduction of something like a neighborhood discussion forum at the local level has a lot of impact on local relationships. In fact, we found that the average person who uses such a neighborhood discussion forum makes about 3 new neighborhood social ties in a year as a result, which is fairly significant over time. That adds up to a lot of relationships. And of course, you don't have to be best friends with your neighbors by any means. It's just really about awareness, and that awareness of people who are living in your local community turns out to be the most important thing when it comes to things like organizing for collective action, dealing with local problems, whether it's crime or problems with a mail carrier or something small, and even being able to help a neighbor who's, say, having some sort of local kind of problem with health or something that you can intervene with.
Sure, I can see that. Okay, well, let's talk about your work more specifically. Your work is actually indicating that social media usage increases stress levels, which I guess isn't that surprising. But I guess the question is to why? Is it people are so aggravated trying to keep up with the technology, the obligation to tweet?
Right. So this will be one of the things I'm talking about tomorrow that I'm looking forward to. And it's really interesting. It's really not the technology that's raising people's stress. So what we found was that the technology use itself, how frequently people are using something like social media or their mobile phone or email, doesn't in itself tend to predict higher stress. In fact, amongst women in particular, we found that the use of many of these technologies was associated with a slightly lower level of psychological stress. But what we did find is that when we measure social stress, which is the stress that you get from being aware of kind of the problems and tribulations of other people in your lives. So when someone close to you, if they know someone who dies, or they know someone who's experiencing bad health or has lost their job, awareness of those kinds of problems creates a social stress that seems to be related to social media use. So those little bits of information that we kind of wonder how valuable they are as they come through those different feeds, they really do add up to this kind of big gulp, right? And just one little bit of information turns out to be really significant if it's about a negative thing that's happening in other people's lives. So it turns out that women in particular, but it's also true for men, but especially for women, they are much more aware of these kind of negative life events that are happening around them as a result of the exposure to these little bits of information through social media.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. All right. You've inspired some of our online audience as well.
Great.
Questions coming in. This one for you, for Keith. Please impart, and I can relate to this one right out of the gates. Please impart one or two pearls of wisdom for a parent with kids active on social media, especially with regards to safety, being able to know what might potentially hurt others or even themselves. We all worry about, kids. When should I let them on the computer? When should I give them a phone that has access to the internet?
Right.
Social media has created a whole other world. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old girl at home. Who knows what things will be like by the time they're on the phone, on the internet, on social media. What do you say? Because I'm sure people find out what you do. They go, oh, so should I let my kid on Facebook? Should I let him on Twitter? And again, we all know someone who has either lost a job or not gotten a job because maybe something silly they posted on social media.
It's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I mean, there are no really perfect answers for this. It's not really a prescriptive thing. I mean, the best thing that you can do, I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old myself. They're certainly not on most social media, but they're starting to text their friends and things like that now. And I think that, just having that sense of trust with your kids early on is really the most important thing when it comes to using social media later. Surveillance doesn't seem to work. Cutting them off, I don't think is necessarily a good idea because these technologies are really an important part of youth culture today. And they provide, these kids with new ways of interacting with very diverse peers and getting the social support of their peers that may not have been available to us, say, in the past. So I don't think that, full-on surveillance is the answer. I don't think that cutting them off is the answer. But I do think, monitoring their use, measuring their use is important, and ensuring that, it doesn't, crop up at inappropriate times. Helping them learn the norms of acceptable use, So in my house, there are no devices allowed at the kitchen table when we're having dinner and things along those lines. And we measure how much screens they have in general. And I think that that's an appropriate thing that we would do when we're not just talking about social media, but about all media use.
It's fascinating stuff. We could talk all evening. I guess we'll just have to take it to Twitter.
Yeah, I think
Tweet
so.
back and forth questions with you. Thank you so much for your time. I
really my
appreciate it.
pleasure.